My daughter was the key to a massive, life-destroying secret, and the people coming for us weren't just criminals. They were the ones who owned the city. I had to choose between burning the truth to the ground or watching my only child pay the price for my wife's hidden life. The air in the living room was thick, heavy with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of betrayal. My daughter Clara stood in the center of the rug, her face flushed, her knuckles white as she gripped the empty velvet casing that had held our family's legacy for 3 generations. "You sold them, Dad? You actually sold our family jewels? Those were Mom's. Those were meant for me." I watched her, my pulse thrumming in my throat, but I couldn't explain. I couldn't tell her that the diamond-encrusted brooch and the sapphire necklace she'd grown up admiring weren't just heirlooms, they were collateral. They were the only things keeping us from total ruin, though not for the reasons she imagined. She thought I was a gambling addict, or perhaps just a man who had lost his grip on reality after my wife passed. She didn't know that for the last decade, I had been navigating a minefield designed to destroy our family from within. "Clara, put the box down," I said, my voice sounding older, thinner than I intended. "No! I want to know why!" she shouted, tears finally spilling over. "I saw the bank statement on your desk. I know you moved the money from the house sale into an offshore account. You're liquidating everything, aren't you? Are you planning to just disappear?" If only it were that simple. If I could just run, I would have done it years ago. But I was shackled to a past I'd tried to bury. My late wife, Sarah, hadn't just been a beautiful, kind woman. She had been a brilliant architect of a life that was far more complicated than I ever realized. She had left behind a mess of legal entanglements involving an organized scheme she had inadvertently crossed years before we even met. When she died, those debts, the moral and the financial, didn't vanish. They were inherited by me, and eventually by Clara. I looked at the empty velvet slot. The jewelry hadn't been sold for a vacation or a gambling debt. It had been sold to pay off a shadowy intermediary who worked for the very group that had been stalking our property lines for months. They were waiting for a payment, a protection fee, to keep them from implicating me in a fabricated case that would lead to a massive prison sentence. I had been told that if I didn't produce the liquid assets by midnight, they would plant illegal weapons in my basement and provide the authorities with enough fake evidence to ensure my life was over before I even reached the courtroom. "It's not what you think," I whispered, stepping toward her, but she recoiled as if I were carrying a disease. "It's always not what I think, isn't it?" she sneered, her voice trembling. "Mom told me you were a man of integrity. She told me to trust you no matter what happened. Well, I'm done trusting." She turned to leave, grabbing her coat, but the front door swung open before she could reach for the handle. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was too early. They weren't supposed to arrive until midnight. 2 men in charcoal gray suits stepped into the hallway. They didn't look like the thugs Clara likely expected. They looked like corporate lawyers, precise and cold. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jaw, didn't even look at me. He looked directly at Clara. "Miss Clara," the man said, his tone disturbingly polite. "Your father has failed to honor the terms of his arrangement. We were under the impression that the jewels would cover the deficit. It seems we were misinformed." Clara stood frozen, her eyes darting between me and the strangers. "Who are you? Dad, who are these people?" "Clara, get behind me," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave. "Oh, she doesn't need to do that," the second man chuckled, pulling a thin, official-looking document from his jacket. "We aren't here for violence, not yet. We're here to collect what's owed, and since your father is short on cash, we've decided to move to the next phase of the agreement." He handed the paper to me. It wasn't a demand for money. It was a formal notification from the local authorities, citing me for a heavy criminal charge, a blatant, life-destroying frame-up regarding an investigation into a network of illegal trade. My name was already on the warrant. "You said you'd stop!" I hissed at the man, the blood draining from my face. "We stop when the trust fund is opened, Mr. Miller," the scarred man said softly. "The one your wife spent years hiding. We know it exists. And now, Clara is going to tell us where the key is." Clara let out a sharp, confused laugh. "A trust fund? We're broke. We don't have a trust fund." The man stepped closer to her, his shadow looming over my daughter. "Oh, you have one, sweetheart. It's worth millions, and you're the only one who can unlock it because your mother didn't use a bank. She used a biometric code, a code that's currently locked in your DNA. Before I could lunge forward, the man reached out and grabbed Clara's arm. She screamed, but the sound was cut short as a black van screeched to a halt in the driveway, and the front door was kicked wide open by people I recognized immediately. Not from the organized scheme, but from the internal security office of the regional police department. "Stay exactly where you are," a voice boomed from the doorway. I looked at the chaos erupting in my home, the criminal network, the internal security investigators, and my daughter caught in the middle of a war she didn't know existed. I knew that in 5 seconds, everything I had protected would be laid bare, and the secret of the trust fund would become the target for every predator in the city. Then, the lights in the house flickered and died, plunging us all into total darkness. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shroud that smelled of ozone and damp earth. In that split second of pitch black, the world felt like it had tilted on its axis. I heard the sharp, frantic intake of Clara's breath, then the muffled sound of a scuffle, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the hardwood floor. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs as I blindly reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth fabric of someone's suit. I didn't know if it was the investigators or the men who had come to ruin us. "Clara!" I screamed into the void, my voice cracking. There was no answer, only the sound of a heavy door being wrenched open and the distant, rhythmic grinding of gravel under tires as a vehicle peeled away from the driveway. My hands finally found the light switch on the wall, clicking it up and down uselessly. The power hadn't just tripped, the entire grid for our sector had been surgically severed. Whoever these people were, they weren't just common criminals. They had access to the city's infrastructure. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. The screen illuminated the room in a ghostly blue hue. The foyer was a scene of clinical devastation. The 2 men in the gray suits were gone, and the investigators from the internal security office were scattered, 2 of them groaning on the floor, their flashlights rolling toward the stairs. One of the investigators, a tall man named Agent Vance, was clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and fury. "Where is she?" Vance spat, struggling to his feet. He looked at me, his gaze accusatory. "You were supposed to keep her protected, Miller. You were supposed to keep the key away from the street level." "Protect her? You sent them here!" I roared, lunging at him, but he easily sidestepped, pinning me against the wall with a forearm to my throat. "We sent a detail to observe, not to intervene. Your daughter is a walking vault, Miller. You've been hiding that from everyone, even your own blood. Now that they know she's the key to the account, she's the most valuable person in this state. If she survives the night, it will be a miracle." "I don't care about the money," I shouted, though the words tasted like ash. "I care about my daughter. Why is her blood the key? What did Sarah do?" Vance leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that made my blood run cold. "Your wife wasn't just an architect, Miller. She was an archivist for a shadow government project. The trust fund isn't just money, it's a list of every high-level official currently compromised by the organized scheme we've been trying to dismantle for years. It's a death warrant for half the city's elite, and the only way to decrypt the file is through a retinal scan or a blood sample from a direct descendant of Sarah." I felt the room spin. Everything I thought I knew, our quiet life, our vacations, the late nights Sarah spent over her drafting table, it was all a facade to keep these files safe. She had turned our own daughter into a human safe, all to keep the leverage they needed to eventually bring the entire criminal structure down. She hadn't left us a fortune, she had left us a burden that could get us killed 1,000 times over. "We have to track her," I said, my voice suddenly deadly calm. "They took her in the black van. I saw the plates." Vance shook his head, his face grim. "The plates were swapped, probably miles ago. But I have a tracker on your property line. It's gone silent, but I know the path they'll take. They're heading toward the docks. They need to get her to a terminal that can bypass the security encryption before the sun comes up." We scrambled out into the night. The rain had begun to fall, a cold, stinging drizzle that blurred the streetlights. We climbed into Vance's unmarked vehicle, the tires spinning on the slick pavement as we sped toward the industrial district. My mind raced through every moment of the last 10 years. Every time Clara had gotten a blood test, every time she'd had a physical, I'd been so careful, so oblivious. I realized then that my house had likely been bugged by both sides for years. I had been living in a goldfish bowl, and I hadn't even noticed the glass. As we reached the edge of the abandoned shipyard, the air grew thick with the smell of rusted iron and stagnant salt water. A lone, rusted warehouse stood at the end of the pier, its windows boarded up and its entrance guarded by two men holding illegal weapons. I could see the black van parked in the shadow of a crane. "Stay here," Vance ordered, drawing his service piece. "If I'm not out in 10 minutes, you drive to the address on this card and give it to the contact listed. Don't look back." I watched him disappear into the shadows, a lone figure against the industrial graveyard. I waited, counting the seconds, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. 5 minutes passed, then 7. A sudden, blinding flash erupted from inside the warehouse, followed by the crack of gunfire. Not the sharp pop of a standard-issue sidearm, but the heavy, sustained report of an automatic. Silence followed, deafening and absolute. I didn't wait for the 10 minutes. I bolted from the car, sprinting toward the flickering light of the doorway. I burst into the warehouse, my breath hitching in my throat. The scene inside was bathed in the red glow of an emergency siren. In the center of the room, strapped to a chair that looked like something out of a medieval torture chamber, was Clara. She was conscious, her eyes wide, staring at a monitor that was projecting a swirling, complex set of biometric data. Standing over her, with a needle poised above her arm, was a woman I hadn't seen before, a woman who looked disturbingly like a younger version of my late wife. She turned to look at me, a cold, predatory smile spreading across her face. "You're late, brother," the woman said, her voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think Sarah would leave the keys to the kingdom to someone as incompetent as you?" She pressed the needle into Clara's skin, and the monitor above them suddenly turned bright green, signaling the bypass of the final encryption. Before I could move, the woman tapped a single key on the console, and a massive, pressurized steel door at the back of the warehouse began to slowly grind open, revealing a hidden bunker filled with crates of illegal materials and a stack of ledgers that would incinerate the city's political elite. Then, the woman looked at me and whispered, "Now, let's see if you're ready to watch the world burn." She pulled a remote from her pocket and clicked it. The entire warehouse began to shudder, and the floor beneath us started to sink. The ground groaned, a deep tectonic screech that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The warehouse wasn't just a hideout, it was a pressurized elevator descending into a subterranean void. Dust rained from the rafters as the ceiling retreated into the dark, and the walls began to slide downward, revealing layer upon layer of reinforced concrete. I stood frozen on the periphery, watching the woman who claimed to be my sister-in-law. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and malice that felt like a physical blow. "Sarah always said you were the ballast," the woman spat, her fingers dancing across the console. "The dead weight that kept her from flying. She kept you around because you were a perfect blindfold, a sweet, oblivious man who made a great scapegoat." Clara screamed, a raw, jagged sound that snapped me out of my paralysis. She was straining against the leather restraints, the needle still embedded in her arm, the biodata on the screen pulsing in sync with her frantic heartbeat. The trust fund wasn't a bank account, it was a digital trigger, and the vault doors were already open. I could see them now, rows of server racks humming with the dark secrets of every judge, police chief, and politician in this city. "Stop it!" I shouted, sprinting toward the center of the platform. "You're killing her! She's just a girl!" The woman didn't even look up. "She's a biometric key, nothing more. And today, the world gets a clean slate. Once these files hit the public cloud, there won't be a court left in this country that isn't burning." I lunged for the woman, but a massive man, a mountain of muscle standing by the shadows, stepped out and caught me with a blow to the ribs that sent me sprawling. The wind left my lungs in a desperate gasp. As I clutched my side, I saw Agent Vance lying near the edge of the descent, unmoving. The scene was a nightmare of gears and glowing screens. "Dad!" Clara cried, her voice weakening. "The floor! Look at the floor!" I squinted through the haze of pain. The platform we were on wasn't just descending, It was locking into a magnetic track. The woman was preparing to initiate a transfer that would wipe the files from the drive and upload them to the internet. But there was a secondary safety protocol. The system was rigged to purge the server racks with a high-intensity chemical gas once the transfer hit 100%. Anyone left in the bunker would be erased along with the evidence. She wasn't just exposing the network, she was performing a total systemic reset. And she didn't care that Clara was trapped inside the blast zone. "You're going to die too," I yelled, pulling myself to my knees. "The purge gas. You think you can get out before it fills the vault?" The woman turned, and for a fleeting second, her cold composure cracked. A flicker of genuine fear shadowed her eyes. "I don't need to get out. I have a remote air filtration pack. You, however, you have 5 minutes to decide who gets to live." She gestured to the console. There were 2 red buttons, each illuminated by a harsh, flickering light. "The system is overloaded. If you force an abort, the entire structure collapses, burying these files, and your daughter, under a mountain of concrete. If you let the transfer finish, the files go live, justice is served, but the purge gas activates, and your daughter dies." My brain felt like it was fracturing. A Sophie's choice in a concrete tomb. I looked at Clara, her skin pale, her eyes pleading. She wasn't just the key, she was the only thing that had ever made my life worth living. "There's a third way," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the servers. "There is no third way!" the woman shrieked, her hand hovering over the execute button. I reached into my pocket, not for a weapon, but for the small, silver locket Sarah had given me on our first anniversary, the one I had always assumed was a sentimental trinket. I had noticed earlier that the locket had a microscopic port on the side, something I'd dismissed as a manufacturing defect for years. Sarah had told me, "In case you ever lose your way, look inside." I fumbled with the clasp, my fingers slick with sweat. As it clicked open, it didn't reveal a photo, it revealed a small, digital override chip. Sarah hadn't just used Clara as a key, she had left me the kill switch. I didn't hesitate. I jammed the chip into the side of the main console. The entire warehouse groaned, the hum of the servers rising to a violent, high-pitched scream. The monitor flickered, the green light turning a dangerous, pulsating violet. The woman gasped, scrambling to regain control, but the system locked her out. The descent stopped abruptly, the elevator jolting with such force that the ceiling began to crack. "What did you do?" she roared, lunging for the console. "I'm choosing my daughter," I said. The vault door began to slam shut, but not with the speed of a seal. It moved with the grinding, mechanical finality of a guillotine. As it descended, I saw a flicker of movement behind the woman. A figure emerged from the shadows. A shadow I thought I recognized, someone I hadn't seen in years. It was a man, face scarred, holding a device that looked like a dampener. The woman turned, her eyes widening, and as she reached for her gun, the man fired. It wasn't a bullet. It was a high-frequency pulse that shattered the electronics in the room. The lights died instantly, and in the resulting silence, I heard a metallic click. The sound of a hidden escape hatch opening somewhere behind Clara's chair. But then, the floor beneath me gave way completely. I felt myself falling, the air rushing past me as the entire structure spiraled into the earth. I grabbed a support beam, hanging over a bottomless, pitch-black chasm, while above me, the woman and the mysterious stranger grappled in the dark. Suddenly, a voice echoed down from the ledge, cold and familiar. It was Sarah's voice, playing from a hidden recording. "If you're hearing this, then you've opened the box. And if you've opened the box, you're already dead." The floor beneath me snapped, and I fell into the dark. The sensation of falling was a chaotic blur of cold air and the sickening whistle of wind against my ears. I braced for the bone-shattering impact of a concrete floor, but instead, I hit a massive, tension-heavy cargo net that was strung across the shaft like a spiderweb. The force knocked the wind out of me, leaving me dangling in the dark, gasping for breath as the net swayed violently. Above me, the echoes of the struggle between the woman and the mysterious man continued, the sharp cracks of movement and the occasional flash of a spark illuminating the shaft. "Clara!" I screamed into the abyss. "I'm here, Dad! I'm here!" Her voice came from below, muffled and terrified. She was in a smaller containment capsule that had detached during the collapse, dangling by a thick, rusted chain just 20 feet beneath my net. I scrambled to climb out of the webbing, my muscles screaming in protest. Every inch of the shaft was lined with exposed conduits and rusted rebar, a testament to the decades of decay in this buried facility. As I maneuvered downward, I realized the facility wasn't just a vault. It was a labyrinthine bunker built beneath the city's oldest infrastructure. Sarah had been hiding things here since before we met. "Hold on, Clara! I'm coming down!" I reached the capsule and grabbed the heavy iron chain. My hands were shredded, bleeding into the cold links, but I didn't care. I peered through the reinforced glass of the capsule. Clara was curled up in the corner, her face smeared with grime, clutching a small, glowing data drive she had somehow ripped from the console. "Dad, you have to take this," she whispered, pointing to the port on the exterior of her capsule. "When the transfer pulse hit, it saved a local copy of the file. It's the full archive. If they get this, they win. If I'm in this thing when it hits the bottom, it's designed to incinerate on impact to protect the evidence." My blood turned to ice. The capsule was a sacrificial chamber designed to destroy the evidence if the trust fund was ever compromised by the wrong people. Sarah hadn't just used Clara as a key, she had built her into the vault's self-destruct mechanism. "I'm not letting that happen," I growled, reaching into my jacket for the last remnants of my strength. I took a heavy metal wrench I'd salvaged from the warehouse floor and jammed it into the primary gear housing of the capsule's descent system. The grinding noise was deafening, sparks showering over us like molten gold. The capsule stopped, shuddering violently as it hung suspended over the final drop, a dark, yawning furnace at the very base of the pit. Suddenly, a heavy boot stepped onto the frame of the capsule. I looked up to see the man who had shot the woman, the stranger with the jagged scar. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his face pale and grim. He held a controller in his hand, his eyes scanning the shaft. "You're wasting your time, Miller," he said, his voice raspy. "That capsule is locked to a remote signal. The moment the facility detects a breach, the incinerator activates. And look up." I looked. The woman, still alive, was perched on a catwalk 50 feet above, holding the master detonator. She wasn't just trying to recover the files. She was going to bury the entire site, including us, to ensure the secret stayed buried forever. "She's going to collapse the tunnels," the man continued. "We have maybe 2 minutes before this entire shaft becomes a mass grave. Give me the drive, and I might be able to override the release sequence." "Why should I trust you?" I snarled. "Because I'm the one who's been paying the protection fees to keep your family alive for 10 years, he said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I'm not the enemy, Miller. I was Sarah's partner, and I've been trying to get her to turn these files over to the right hands for a decade." I stared at him. The betrayal felt like a mountain pressing down on my chest. Every time I thought I had reached the bottom of this hole, I found another layer of deceit. My wife had lived a double life, surrounded by spies, partners, and hidden bunkers, while I had been playing the role of the devoted, oblivious husband. "The drive," he insisted, extending his hand. "If we don't dump it into the interface, the incinerator won't disengage. The capsule will drop, and your daughter will be vaporized." Clara looked at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying, adult clarity. "Dad, give it to him. It's the only way." "No!" I shouted. The woman above shouted a command, and I heard the sickening sound of a hydraulic seal breaking. The capsule beneath me groaned, the chain starting to slip. "She's releasing the primary winch!" the man screamed. The capsule dropped 6 feet, then jerked to a halt, the metal groaning under the strain. I lunged for the drive in Clara's hand, but as I reached for it, a shot rang out from above. The man's shoulder exploded in a spray of blood, and he tumbled back, falling past me into the dark, his body hitting the shaft walls with a sickening thud. I was alone, clinging to a dropping capsule with my daughter inside, with a woman intent on burying us both, and a data drive that contained the names of people who would kill to keep it secret. I looked at the drive, then at the incinerator yawning beneath us, its glowing red sensors pulsing like the eye of a monster. I realized then that there was no way to save the data and save us. I had to choose. I held the drive up, the plastic casing catching the light of the emergency flares. "If I drop it, Will you let her go? I yelled up at the woman on the catwalk. She laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You have no leverage, Miller. You're already buried. She clicked the detonator. A massive explosion ripped through the ceiling of the shaft, and a torrent of concrete and steel began to rain down upon us. The capsule's main support cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and we began a freefall toward the furnace. I didn't let go of the chain. I gripped it with every ounce of strength I had, screaming for Clara as the light of the vault vanished into a sea of falling debris. But as we hit the bottom, instead of fire, the floor felt soft. It wasn't the floor of the incinerator. The capsule had slammed into a secondary, hidden partition, and the doors blasted open, not with fire, but with a gust of fresh, cold mountain air. We weren't at the bottom of a bunker. We were looking out at a tunnel leading to the river. I tumbled out, pulling Clara with me, and we rolled onto the wet concrete of an underground drainage system. I looked back, expecting the warehouse to collapse on top of us. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the shadows of the tunnel exit, holding a phone to their ear. It was Vance, the investigator I thought was left for dead. He didn't look at me with sympathy. He looked at me with cold, professional efficiency. "Secure the target and the drive," he said into the phone. "The package is out of the bunker. And tell the team, Miller is no longer a liability. He's a witness." He looked directly at me then, and his eyes weren't the eyes of a cop. They were the eyes of the man who had been running the entire organized scheme from the shadows all along. He stepped forward, and behind him, a dozen armed men emerged from the darkness. "Nice work, Miller. Now tell me, where's the rest of the encryption key?" The air in the tunnel was thick with the scent of stagnant water and impending dread. Vance stood there, his presence radiating a kind of clinical lethality that made my skin crawl. The armed men behind him moved with the synchronized precision of a military unit, their weapons leveled not at the exit, but directly at me and Clara. My heart was a sledgehammer against my ribs, but looking at my daughter, bruised, trembling, yet alive, something in me shifted. The fear that had paralyzed me for years evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. "The key?" I repeated, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos in my mind. "You think there's a key, Vance? You've been chasing a ghost for 10 years. You and Sarah's partner, the woman on the catwalk, you've all been fighting over a box that's already empty." Vance narrowed his eyes, his finger twitching near the guard of his sidearm. "Don't play games, Miller. The data drive in your hand is the archive. The biometric override is the key. You have it, or your daughter does. Hand it over, and maybe you get to walk out of this drain alive." I looked down at the drive in my palm. It was just a small, unassuming piece of plastic, yet it had cost lives, shattered families, and brought an entire city's power structure to its knees. I thought of Sarah. She hadn't been a victim. She had been a master tactician. She knew that if she left the information in a bank or a vault, they would eventually find it. So she hid the truth in plain sight, using me as a distraction and Clara as a decoy, while the real trust fund was being broadcast in real time to a secure server that she had set up long before her death. "You want the data?" I asked, a faint smile touching my lips. I pulled the drive from my pocket and held it out. As Vance stepped forward, eager and arrogant, I didn't hand it to him. I dropped it directly into the rushing, dark water of the drainage canal. "No!" one of the men roared, lunging forward, but it was already gone, swept away by the powerful current toward the river. Vance's face went purple with rage. He lunged at me, his hand grabbing my collar, pinning me against the damp concrete wall. "You idiot! That was the only copy. Do you have any idea what you've destroyed?" "I destroyed your leverage," I whispered, meeting his gaze without blinking. "And you should check your own communications, Vance, because while you were busy trying to terrorize a father and daughter in a shipyard, the trust fund wasn't in that drive. That drive was a lure. The real data, the real evidence, was uploaded to the cloud the moment the vault sensors detected your team's illegal interference. It's sitting in the inbox of every major news outlet in the country right now. Your organized scheme isn't being saved, it's being archived as public record." Vance froze. His phone, tucked into his tactical vest, began to vibrate incessantly, then ring, then buzz again. He pulled it out, his thumb hovering over the screen, and his face turned ashen as he read the notifications streaming in. The color drained from his skin until he looked like a ghost. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with the realization of his own ruin. "You and your wife," he hissed, his voice a low, strangled vibration. "She didn't just use you. She turned you into a trap." "She protected her family," I said, "and she made sure that people like you would never be able to hold power over anyone ever again." Before Vance could respond, the sound of sirens, not the panicked, disorganized sirens of a private security firm, but the sustained, synchronized wail of city and federal law enforcement, began to echo through the tunnel. Searchlights cut through the gloom, reflecting off the water. The internal security team had finally arrived, but they weren't the ones Vance was expecting. This was a sweep, coordinated by the very people Sarah had whispered to years ago. Vance dropped his weapon, his posture collapsing as the reality of his situation hit him. The men around him scrambled, looking for an escape, but the tunnel was blocked on both sides by tactical teams. The hunt was over. Hours later, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, hopeful orange. I sat on the back of an ambulance, a thin wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the authorities process the scene. They were hauling out server racks, ledgers, and the woman who had claimed to be my sister-in-law, her face hidden behind a dark hood. Clara sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. She was quiet, the weight of the last 24 hours etched into her young face, but for the first time in years, the tension that had lived in her jaw was gone. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over," I replied, pulling her closer. I reached into my pocket and felt a small, hard object. It was the override chip I had pulled from the locket, the one that had stopped the vault in the nick of time. I looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the drainage water, watching it sink into the dark. We didn't need secrets anymore. We had the truth, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. The world was changing, the corrupt were being exposed, and the shadows we'd lived in were being swept away by the light of a new day. As the ambulance pulled away from the shipyard, I didn't look back at the warehouse or the ruins of our old life. I looked forward, toward a future that was finally, truly ours to build. We were tired, we were scarred, but we were free. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, without the burden of the past, in a life that was finally entirely our own.